Modern physics is a disaster, and why it matters to freedom. Why would a channel called Malayan English be doing a video about modern physics? Physics is considered the pinnacle of reason, and any attack on reason is an attack on freedom. In addition, as Malay says, we have to win the cultural war. We can't ignore the nonsense going on in modern physics and expect to win the cultural war. First, I'll expose how far off track modern physics has become and how divorced from reason it is. I have already done a video on mathematical Platonism. Mathematical Platonism infects physics as well as other areas of science, and this is not science. It's religion dressed up in fancy mathematical equations. I think a couple of quotes from the well-known physicist Richard Feynman will set the stage for this. Feynman, when discussing the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, says, "The theory of quantum electrodynamics describes nature as absurd from the point of view of common sense, and it fully agrees with experience. I hope you can accept nature as she is absurd." Feynman also said, "String theorists don't make predictions, they make excuses." There are numerous books pointing out how modern physics has gone off the rails and is becoming detached from reality. An example is this book called The Trouble with Physics: The Rise of String Theory, Fall of Science, and What Comes Next. This book discusses ambitious ideas about extra dimensions, exotic particles, multiple universes, and strings that have captured the public attention and the imagination of experts. But these have not been tested experimentally, and some, like string theory, seem to offer no possibility of being tested. Yet these speculations dominate the field. Modern science has created a climate in which emerging physicists are often penalized for pursuing less popular avenues. The author points out that this situation threatens to impede the very progress of science. Here's another book entitled Not Even Wrong: Failure of String Theory and the Search for Unity in Physical Law. Here's yet another book entitled The End of Physics: The Myth of the Unified Theory. You can find many other books on the fact that physics has gone off the rails. The next book is called Farewell to Reality: How Modern Physics has Betrayed the Search for Scientific Truth. This is a book I've reviewed in depth. In the book Farewell to Reality, the author explores the state of modern physics and suggests that theoretical physics is passed over into fairy tales. This book is very well written and is probably the best overview of modern theoretical physics I've ever read. The author starts out by providing the standard understanding of modern physics. Then he proceeds to examine some of the problems in physics, starting with Newton's gravity as a force at a distance. He examines some of the early debates about quantum mechanics, and then he moves on to the standard model of particle physics and cosmology. Next, he covers string theory, M-bane, and M-theory and related ideas. In my opinion, the author gives most of these ideas in physics the benefit of the doubt. He is respectful and provides overwhelming arguments before he calls any particular model fairy tale physics. Like many of these books, he is most critical of string theory. But the problems in modern physics don't just stop there. They go to the fundamental core. For instance, Heisenberg said the law of causality is no longer applied in quantum theory. In order to be coherent, physicists today should no longer try to find the physical cause of any physical phenomena. There is no cause. It's simply magic, said another author. Quantum mechanics is magic. Another physicist said the results of those absurd interpretations are enjoyable, and writes the EPR experiment is so close to magic as any physical phenomena I know of, and magic should be enjoyed. Anyone who discusses magic and physics in the same breath is not a physicist, and clearly not a scientist. Here's another quote from Heisenberg talking about how modern physics has divorced itself from reason and reality. Quote, "The next step was taken by Berkeley. If actually all our knowledge is derived from perception, then there's no meaning to the statement that things really exist. Because if perception is given, it cannot possibly make any difference whether the things exist or do not exist. Therefore, to be perceived is identical with existence." Berkeley here is George Berkeley, who was a philosopher who clearly believes that our perceptions create reality. This is the opposite of science. This is complete undermining of the scientific project from the Enlightenment. Here's a list of some of the problems that exist in the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. It requires infinite velocity. It talks about spin, which makes no sense for point particles. They talk about point particles that are assumed to occupy no space. They are accompanied by infinite charge density, infinite mass density, and infinite energy density. Then these infinities get moved around once more by something called renormalization. It's all completely crazy. Einstein, who was hardly pure, called it Ptolemaic epicycles all over again. The laser is a perfect example of how modern physics ignores reality and contradictions. At the heart of a laser is the perfect alignment of crests and troughs of a myriad of waves of light. Their location and momentum must be theoretically knowable, but this violates the holiest canon of the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. Bohr and von Neumann, who were both true believers in the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, both denied that the laser was possible. Carver Mead, who studied under Feynman and worked closely with him, had this to say about the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. Quote, "It's my firm belief that the last 7 decades of the 20th century will be characterized in history as the dark ages of theoretical physics. Einstein's special and general theory of relativity don't get off the hook here either. At the very core of relativity is the problem that Newton warned about in his Principia. That is, Einstein confuses the entities with the measure of the entities. For instance, length with the measure of length, and time with the measure of time. Therefore, Einstein confuses what the clock does with what is actual time. If this had been done during the navigation crisis, instead of the clockmaker trying to make better clocks, the conclusion would have been that time on the ocean doesn't work. It just jumps around randomly. So I think it's fair to say that modern physics is a failure. But as this next clip shows, modern physics is not only a failure, it's committing fraud on a huge scale, stealing billions of dollars from taxpayers.
Actually, I'd like to ask you next time, think not only about short-term personal benefits, but about the community in general. You understand what consequences your publication might bring for our community? What are all these BSM model builders with exaggerated self-opinion going to do afterwards? What about experimentalists who survive hiding inside big multi-TV collaborations? Can you offer them all any decent employment alternatives? Some of them have families and young children. Some of them are already too old to get employment elsewhere. For some of them, academia is the only way to get US visa. If you like, yes, what we created is a bubble, but it helps thousands of those guys and their families not to die from hunger. We all do the same stuff and have some trade secrets. For example, I'm one of the authors of the so-called model. Pretty useless stuff, old refurbished with a couple of new blows and whistles. But if people buy this and it helps them to get grants. Who cares? For people who pay us, all we do is just noise. They have zero idea that elementary particles exist. They pay us from public funds, not from their own, and basically pay for something cool, some new crazy hype, which they need either to include into their science spending reports or, in case of universities, to attract students. Your paper made a lot of noise and most likely will affect redistribution of HEP funds towards other areas, but I doubt that you'll be able to suggest and implement any organizational changes. Also, any changes of quality criteria which would demonstrate uselessness of somebody's work will have zero chance of approval. I understand that all what I wrote above might sound a bit harsh, sorry for this, but this is how our society is built, and this is not only a problem in the HEP community, but also exists in all other areas. My heart is bleeding when I regularly see bright and intelligent persons with independent ways of thinking leaving academia or getting kicked out, whereas obedient idiots remain. But there's nothing we can do. Those who get kicked out usually find better opportunities outside of academia. Those who remain in academia accept the rules and enjoy the comfort of academic life. Of course, sometimes there are exceptions, like string theorists Smolin and White, but I doubt you'd like to share their destiny. So they told you that this Dune experiment that's being built from some billions of dollars of public funds at Fermilab will tell us why we exist or why the universe didn't disappear. I regret to inform you that it won't do any such thing. Regardless of what the result of the Dune experiment will be, it'll not tell us why the universe contains more matter than antimatter, because this question is impossible to answer within the context of our current theory.
But not only is modern physics a failure and a fraud, it was designed to be this way. It was designed to be an attack on reason from the very beginning. I would date the beginning of modern physics from the ideas of Ernst Mach, who attempted, I think, unsuccessfully to show Newton's ideas of absolute space and time is wrong. Ernst Mach, as well as many of the so-called heroes of modern physics, were highly influenced by the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, and they tried to tailor physics to fit Immanuel Kant's metaphysical and epistemological concepts. Kant's whole epistemology was an attack on reason. Immanuel Kant even said he needed to limit reason in order to create space for faith. Quote, "I had to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith." Clearly, he was trying to make room for religion and superstition, which is the exact opposite of the Enlightenment project of science, which gave us so much success in physics. But Einstein, Bohr, Heisenberg, etc., these people were all trained in the ideas of the German philosophical tradition, like Immanuel Kant. One of the reasons these theories of these modern physicists was pushed by the mainstream media and academia was in order to be an attack on reason and therefore freedom. Religious people jumped on board, suggesting that free will could be found in the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which is just philosophical nonsense and bullshit. So not only has modern physics divorced itself from reality, not only is it a fraud, but it was a project designed to undermine reason from the very beginning. Reason is the foundation of freedom. Modern physics has been pushed by anti-freedom people to suggest things like everything's all relative and other attacks on reason, like there's no cause and effect, to push the most vile and tyrannical ideology. Critics of this modern physics nonsense were quickly squelched in the same manner in which people who point out the absurdities of climate change are attacked today. Modern physics has become a religion. It's a mathematical religion, much like the Pythagorean Brotherhood, but it's a religion nonetheless. Luckily, more and more people are beginning to push back on the absurdity of this government-funded religion. And there are now a number of channels on YouTube devoted almost exclusively to pointing out the absurdities and fallacies associated with this modern religion. Many of them also propose solutions. I don't endorse any particular one, but it's good to see that there's a recognition that modern physics has completely gone off the rails. Not only has this hurt our ability to advance technology, it's undermined reason and freedom. So what can we do? Well, first of all, we have to root out the absurdities of the Kantian epistemology and its Platonic basis. And we also need to bury the stupid idea from David Hume that induction isn't valid. We need to return to Aristotle's laws of reason. First and foremost, we must apply the law of identity, which the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics and relativity both attack. We also have to recover the law of causality. Heisenberg's absurd attack on causality just turns physics into a goddamn religion. We also have to demand that true science follow the law of non-contradiction, which the Copenhagen interpretation openly attacks, ignoring contradictions. We also have to get rid of the idea that the observer affects reality. This is pure mysticism and destroys the very basis of science. We need to relearn Bacon's ideas on the rules of induction. We also need to recognize that induction and deduction cannot be separated from each other. I pointed this out in one of my earlier videos. We also need to root out at its very core the weed of mathematical Platonism, which is dominating so much of science today. Not only in physics and economics, but you can also see this in the COVID nonsense and the climate change bullshit. We need to also recognize that the pseudosciences that fall under the category of social sciences aren't science. In other words, we need to get back to the correct philosophy of science. Once we get back to the correct philosophy of science, we need to re-examine all of modern physics at its core, starting with Mach and Einstein's ideas and the beginnings of the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, and re-examine all the interpretations of the experiments that were supposedly the fundamentals of quantum mechanics and relativity. For instance, the photoelectric effect, which re-examined can be put in proper scientific terms instead of the nonsense that was pushed. Last but not least, we need to eliminate government funding of science. Government funding of science isn't science, it's propaganda. The goals of politicians and politics are the exact opposite of those of science. Politics is not interested in the truth, it's interested in control. Science is about the truth. We need to eliminate government funding of science for the same reason that we have separation of church and state. We need to have separation of science and state. As climate change has shown, when government funds science, it really is funding a religion. It's a violation of the First Amendment. Of course, the founders would have never thought that government would fund science, so they wouldn't have thought to make this point in the Constitution. But it's a clear, logical conclusion from the First Amendment that science cannot be funded by government. And as I've said, modern physics has been an attack on reason from the very beginning. That was its goal. It's been very successful because the so-called most fundamental science has shown that reason is impotent. Any attack on reason is an attack on freedom. Long live freedom, damn it.